こんなことに関わってすごく後悔してる。
自分で選んだんじゃないの。
I am baffled by Wonder Egg Priority's popularity. Almost every review I see for this show has been overwhelmingly positive, with multiple reviewers calling it a masterpiece, a beautiful, brave, symbolic show that is willing to tackle harsh, real issues. And I can't deny that on the surface, there's a lot going for this show. The animation and character designs are lively and pretty, the plot moves at a brisk pace, the directing it's fine, and the show deals with its dark subject matter head-on. Compared to a lot of other shows last season, it definitely stands out. But while I see where they come from, I don't know how so many people end up thinking this is a good show. Because under the pretty animation and sentimental setting, this show is nothing more than another primetime TV melodrama written by a screenwriter who's made many similar shows before. Wonder Egg Priority attempts to tell a story about empowering young girls, but much like Nojima's other works, it is far more interested in showing girls suffer, without much of a point. On a technical level, this show is unfocused and takes on too many upsetting themes for it to handle. The battles are uninteresting, and the show takes a tell-don't-show approach towards developing its characters and their relationships. Despite the efforts of the directors and animators to add nuanced visual storytelling, the clunky, awkward script tells you exactly what to feel in every emotional scene. At the same time, the supposedly hopeful message of the show can just as easily be read as a blanket endorsement of nihilism. Yet so many anime fans think it's doing something revolutionary and incredible, they're even telling themselves that this show is too deep and smart for them to understand. Look, I know I'm coming off as harsh, but let me explain who the writer Nojima Shinji is. Nojima is a 58-year-old screenwriter who has worked on over 30 dramas since 1988 and has created multiple hit shows. He started his career in TV writing with romance dramas, and his first big hit was a rom-com called 101回目のプロポーズ, or The 101st Proposal. What dramatically changed his writing style and made him a star screenwriter, though, was the show Koukou Kyoshi, or High School Teacher. This show focused on a romance between a high school teacher and a female student, but it also covered homosexuality, rape, incest, teen pregnancy, and suicide. In the following year, he would direct his biggest project, the Ienakiko, or Without Family series. This story focused on a girl facing domestic abuse until she burns down her own house in an attempt to kill her father, becomes homeless, joins a group of thieves that abuse her, and helps them do robberies in order to get enough money to pay for her dying mother's hospital costs. Her mom dies, and then she gets picked up and abused by a circus in a subsequent movie, escapes the circus, and in the second season, she reunites with her father and needs money to help him, so she pretends to be the granddaughter of some rich guy, attends a private school, is found out to be lying about her identity, and then gets bullied and abused at the rich kid school. Another notable show by Nojima is Miseinen, or Minors, which focuses on a group of teenage boys. This one depicts gang violence, teen pregnancy, friends dying, girlfriends dying, teens dropping out of school, and the police coming after the boys after they shoot up a bank. Seija no Shinko, or When the Saints Go Marching In, is about the physical and sexual abuse of teens with mental disorders. From his more recent works, there's Ashita Mama ga inai, or Mom Won't Be Here Tomorrow, from 2014, which focuses on kids in the foster care system who are, of course, frequently abused. There's a bunch of romantic dramas he's done between these shows I mentioned, but these are the ones I thought are worth talking about for this essay. I could go into more detail, but hopefully it's clear from these summaries that Nojima's writing makes a show out of tragedies, and I don't think WEP is an exception to this. To further explain where I'm coming from, when I first started watching WEP, I was pretty excited to see an anime that mixed surreal horror with grounded personal stakes. But as more episodes were released, I became more upset at the show. But I didn't understand why WEP felt so off to me. It didn't have the cliches and pacing problems that I'm used to seeing in other bad anime. However, when I realized that this is a show written by a guy who has been making primetime TV shows for the last 30 years, the flaws became apparent. Nojima is a man who made a name for himself by writing about traumatic experiences and tragedies of all kinds, specifically to shock the viewer. It is not a coincidence that many of his sensational dramas lost sponsors during the course of their run for being too grim and taboo. And frankly, I expect that from Asian dramas. I know unlike US television, Japanese TV doesn't have a strong concept of prestige television. Screenwriters are there to make shows that pull in views, and Nojima gets the job done by making tragedy porn. What pisses me off about WEP though, is that it tries to disguise itself as some art piece deeper than that, and how a lot of people have fallen for that trick. The way Web depicts suffering and trauma pretty much brings down all parts of its story, but let me start with the overall structure. Web's main plot involves 4 girls, each trying to revive someone who committed suicide. To revive them, the main cast needs to protect girls who hatch out of Wonder Eggs and fight Wonder Killers, which are the manifestations of the Egg Girl's trauma. This setup is pretty straightforward, and is perfect for the Monster of the Week structure, where the physical and emotional conflicts between the protagonists, Egg Girls, and monsters are tied together and resolved within individual episodes. This is a template that magical girl shows like Pretty Cure, Sailor Moon, and Utena follow. But we also have characters like Mr. Sawaki and Rika's mom, who play significant roles in the girls' lives, as well as the shady Akka brothers and the overarching mystery of the Wonder Egg system itself. Taken together, this is a lot of ground to cover in a 13-episode anime, especially when so many of these stories are so heavy. If Web wants to cover all these relationships and stories with the care and nuance the subject matter demands, it needs really, really smart writing. And I think the first 2 episodes understood the need to tie the central character's personal conflict together with the Wonder Egg Girl's trauma. Episode 1 was about saving a girl who was bullied, much like Ai's friend Koito, and the resolution was Ai deciding to stop being a bystander for bullying, which gave her the power to fight back the monster. The second episode is sort of the same thing, but it's more focused on the fear of admitting to yourself that you need help and the need to stand up to your abusers. These 2 stories are linked to Ai's personal development. Her personal conflict was that she was a reserved, scared girl who let Koito die, and she needed to grow into someone who can speak out and directly confront problems. By the end of episode 2, we see her become a proactive person, both in her personal life and in battle. We actually see her develop as a result of the Wonder Killer fights. But from episode 3 onwards, this connection between the characters' main goals, the Wonder Egg Girls, the Wonder Egg system, and the many other conflicts become a lot flimsier, because the show introduces way more plot points than it can hope to address by the end of its 13-episode run. If this was a kids show with over 30 episodes, I wouldn't mind having a couple of weak characters and sidelining the main mission to develop the main cast. But again, the personal conflicts of Web are way too serious and gloomy to cover respectfully within 13 episodes. The show is left to pick and choose what it wants to focus on and pushes other plot lines off to the side whenever it likes, including the girls' main goals. For example, the Wonder Killer we see Ai and Rika fight in episodes 3 and 4 was a stalker of a singer who died, and the girls from the Wonder Eggs committed suicide to chase after the singer. Do these episodes discuss unhealthy fan behavior in a meaningful way? No, it's used to establish Rika's backstory with a character she rarely talks about afterwards. How about Nader? She's painted as apathetic and distant towards the Wonder Egg Girls, but I think we're supposed to see her open up to them as she opens up to her real-life friends. But instead of seeing that process, all we get is Kotobuki, someone who was already close to her, telling her out loud that she's changed. We don't actually see her develop through the fights or conversations with the other protagonists. The whole plotline of Koito, Ai, and Ai's mom all having romantic interest in Ai's teacher Sawaki is so disconnected from what Ai was dealing with in the beginning of the show. This plotline could have been discarded entirely. Momoe has the inverse of this problem, where she's only characterized by her Wonder Egg fights. Her interactions with the rest of the cast feel like they're only there to reinforce what's already established, that her presentation and gender identity get mistaken, or to complicate Ai's feelings for Sawaki. The show is just about done at the time I'm writing this, and the plot feels really scattered and like it's both rushing and failing to wrap things up. And it's because the show sucks at connecting any of its numerous plotlines into a cohesive narrative. And I don't think Web ever had what it takes to string together all these stories it wanted to tell. The writing was pretty bad from early on, especially if you look at the fights. Like I said earlier, the animation in Web is pretty, but everything else about it is mediocre at best. For starters, what determines whether a girl is able to win in a fight? Well, the show actually says it itself. Believe in yourself and crack the egg. This sucks, because the battles are dictated only by what the writer wants the characters to go through emotionally, and is not based on anything measurable like skill, strength, or smarts. Except for that one time Nato and Kotobuki solved a middle school geometry problem. As long as the girls believe in themselves, they are practically invincible in the dream world. This drains fights of any conflict they might have, because they can, and always do, turn on a dime whenever the episode runtime expires. And unlike shows like Evangelion and Madoka, Web lacks the polish and details that are supposed to give depth to these fights. For example, I can tell that each girl is supposed to have a unique weapon, but the battle choreography is super underwhelming. It's mostly just a lot of jumping around from different angles, with no clever use of their weapons or discernible strategies employed by the girls. Even when the girls get pets, the battles using the pets are equally unimaginative and only last for a few seconds. The girls throw them out like Pokemon and use them as shields and vehicles, which become even more offensively stupid when you realize they mainly exist to do away the fights involving the Xeno evils and haters that the show no longer has time to depict because it needs to spend every minute addressing the various plot points it failed to connect earlier. The show doesn't need these minor antagonists anymore, but it can't get rid of them now. Speaking of things the show doesn't need anymore, do you remember when the girls brought back their injuries from the dream world into reality? Because I don't think the show does. It's too bad that was the only cool thing about the battles. What offends me the most though are the Wonder Killers themselves. These monsters are supposed to be exaggerated manifestations of the Egg Girl's trauma, but they're drawn like weird clowns, minor Yu-Gi-Oh antagonists, or budget personas. They don't have interesting gimmicks like the persona bosses, nor are they well thought out enough to allow audiences to read into them like Madoka wishes. They're just abstract versions of the girls' abusers who tell us out loud why they're terrible and scary. I feel embarrassed by all the Twitter threads and YouTube videos attempting to analyze these monsters because there's nothing to analyze there beyond the surface level. Except maybe, haha, Nakato Joji's playing another priest.
What's
worse is that there isn't even any meaningful insight on how to defeat these abusers in real life. They say scummy, victim-blamey things, the girls get mad, they say their terrible catchphrases, and defeat them in one powerful blow. This brings us to the awful dialogue of the show. Seriously, has anyone actually paid attention to what is being said by these characters? Either they're telling you exactly what is happening and exactly how you should feel, or super cheesy, or are trying to sound cool and failing. You know Ai's catchphrase, "Now I'm mad"? What she actually says is "Tosaka ni kita," which literally translates to "that got to my rooster comb," like that got to my head. A better localization would be something like "you ruffled my feathers," but I don't think they went with that because it's dumb. Neiru's "I'll blow your mind" is dumb in English, but it's "dogimo tsuku," "I'll blow your liver" in Japanese. Episode 9 alone has a handful of egregious lines.
I don't have parents because I was born from artificial insemination.
That's not how parents work.
She analyzed the mysteries of life.
Isn't that what all scientists do?
Albino geniuses are rare.
There's nothing inherently special about albinos for being albino. That is literally the joke of Pete White.
We don't need that much room for what we do. And that's why we can't pay that much. Because we don't do that much.
We actually don't do anything.
There are so many scenes in the show that try to convey some kind of sincere mood, but totally lose me because the dialogue falls flat. And I think the dialogue in this show sucks because there wasn't enough effort put into creating multi-dimensional characters. A common thing I hear from fans of the show is that they like seeing this group of depressed friends hang out and fight monsters together. But what actually tells us that these girls are friends? Sure, they have a common goal, we see them hang out together, and they're aware of each other's trauma. These all sound like things that friends do and share, but it really does tell us what kind of dynamic these characters have with each other. Like, friends are people who like the interactions they have with each other, right? So what tells us that these girls like each other? Well, like I said earlier, the girls talk about the trauma, and that's usually reserved for people who you trust, like your friends. But these girls are pretty insensitive when they talk about each other's trauma. Their conversations often get confrontational and uncomfortable. Like when Momoi gets understandably upset when her uncle gets suspected to be involved in Ai's friend's suicide. But they get together and hang out lots, you know, like they celebrated Rika's birthday. Even though Rika blew up at them when they didn't sympathize with her. But it's okay, because I talked to Rika to tell her that she understands how she feels. Yeah, mom problems. And sure, the other two didn't actually talk to her after that. But look, they're friends, so they know she's okay. Even though later in that episode she wasn't okay, and it wasn't Rika's friends calling out to her that snapped her out of her depression episode in battle, it was her pet turtle. Episode 9 ends up with Ai being the only one there to console Neiru as well. And no one even texted Momoe when they found out that she successfully revived her friend, leaving her scared and traumatized alone. You see my problem here? When picturing depressed friends hanging out together, I imagine people supporting, sympathizing, sometimes simply letting each other rant about trauma and helping each other cope. But Web's friendship isn't that. It's 2 minutes of stereotypical teenager activity, followed up by an awkward, uncomfortable tone shift. Sometimes Rika just says to stop talking about depressing stuff to end the conversation entirely. And this happens pretty much every episode since all 4 of the girls get together. The show looks like it gives them time to bond and have fun, but in reality, they're constantly interrupted by personal doom and gloom. The show is there to remind you, even in the lighthearted scenes, that all these girls are together only because they have traumatic pasts. Moreover, in the instances where we do see these girls getting along, it feels forced and unrealistic. They constantly say stuff like, "Isn't it wonderful we're friends?" and "I'm having so much fun," and "This is our story that no one else knows about." They do quirky friend stuff like say things in sync, but the things they're actually talking about are either explaining each other's backstory to one another or theorizing about their issues. The most bizarre instance of their bonding was when there was obvious tension between Rika and Nader, and Rika just goes up to Nader and starts tickling her, forcing her to laugh, and the other two look at them like, "Oh hey, they actually get along." What? No! Getting tickled and laughing shouldn't be taken as someone having fun. The script forced Nader to laugh, and it wants us to interpret that as a sign of friendship? That is not going to pass. It is so obvious to me that Nojima only sees interactions like these as a box he needs to check in order to get to the tragedy he wants to focus on.
私は女子社会に向いてないのかもしれない。
どうして？
思ったことを口に出してしまう。
Alright, so I ranted on and on about how Web sucks on a technical level, but maybe you still see merit in these characters and what they represent. The teenage suffering is overbearing and the character relationships are awkward, but this show is still a story about facing trauma and has an empowering message for teenage girls, right? I mean, I guess Web says no bullying, I guess Web says fuck you to sexual harassers, and I guess Web does say trans rights. But you know, none of these things are revolutionary in 2021 for the intended audience of the show. We don't need to see kids dying to understand why rape is bad. Furthermore, the actual worldview of the story is a lot more sexist and nihilistic than a lot of people realize, and is shown in the characters' stories and the show's overarching narrative. Before I complain more, let's get the good bits out of the way. I have the least issue with Rika. I think her character is consistent throughout the series, and her story and issues are the most grounded amongst the main cast. The show's rather optimistic take on self-harm was pretty refreshing too, since it showed that it understands self-harm as not some mental illness, but signs of struggling and a willingness to live. I also think her story about her mother and men had an appropriate level of nuance. I've seen other reviewers talk about how episode 7 is a depiction of a child dealing with an alcoholic parent, but I think it's a little more specific than that. See, Rika's mom used to be a hostess and now runs a snack bar, which is basically an independently run hostess bar. Rika also has a history of being an underground idol, an occupation reliant on flirting mostly with male fans, and she has the fear of ending up like her mother. The question Rika's character poses is, what happens to women, and the children of women, who spend their life in sex work adjacent industries that are reliant on shallow flirtatious relationships with men? And I think this is an issue totally worth talking about, especially after COVID hit the nightlife industry in Japan super hard, along with the general spike in female suicides related to job loss. Sadly, the story is limited to Rika's perspective and ends up coming off as sex work ruins women. It would have been more satisfying for me if Rika empathized with her mom beyond feeling responsible for her as her daughter. Still, Rika's resolve to stick it through with her mom until she has the power to lead the life she wants was a fair resolution. So Nader, I don't really get her character, but what I do know is that she's the least relatable person in the main cast. She's a 14-year-old parentless genius who doesn't go to school and runs a super IQ company, and her sister tried to kill her by literally stabbing her in the back. Okay. But like I mentioned earlier, I think her character arc was supposed to be that she starts to open up to her friends and herself more through the interpersonal bonds she makes. It's too bad this show sucks at showing that. But you know what it did show me? It showed me that being a girl boss is bad. Hear me out. You know the scene in episode 4 where Nader mistakes Momoi as a guy, and then the Akka brothers start spewing gender essentialist bullshit? We'll get to those two later, but the punchline of that scene was, guys and girls may be different, but this is a place made for people who commit suicide and regret it. So stop being a man-hater, Nader.
そうだよ、差別は良くねえよ。
は？
This combined with how Rika teases her by saying overachieving women ruin men, Neiru's exasperated reaction towards Rika's boy craziness, her worry about not fitting into female society, and how Neiru's emotional change is reflected in her becoming more traditionally feminine, tells me that being a logically thinking, boy-hating, independent lady is a bad thing. Speaking of gender, let's move on to Momoe, who I am mostly just sad for. First things first, judging by how the assigned female at birth trans boy appeared as a wonder egg, something supposedly only female assigned people can do, I read Momoe as a cis girl who gets mistaken as a guy and forced into male roles. I won't say I trust Nojima to write a trans girl character well, but it would have been a stronger story if Momoe was a trans girl herself. Momoe isn't just a weird iteration of a Yuri stereotype, she's this unrealistic anime archetype of a cis person who somehow ended up passing as another gender despite wanting to pass as the gender they were assigned. I don't really understand what she wants to do because she should know by now that the online clout she's hinted to have is not worth all the awkward confessions she gets, and that she can't dress and present feminine like she wants to. Like, what is holding her back from wearing the skirt uniform like the rest of the female students? This is why I don't think her experiences are comparable to the actual trans boy who got raped and had an abortion. Hey, so are we still defining trans characters by their trauma? I also feel like the whole world is out to spite Momoe. She doesn't actually add much to her friend dynamic, and again, I don't think her friends are actually looking out for her. And why are the gays only there to make her miserable? She doesn't like girls confessing to her, but it keeps on happening. And she feels like she tricked the gay guy who asked her out. I know there are a lot of Yuri-starved anime fans out there, but I wish so many people didn't call the web girls gay because I don't want to give this show any more undeserved credit. Everyone is welcome to headcanon all they want, but Mr. Sawaki, Rika's general boy craziness, and Momoe's one-off date all point to them being hetero. But hey, at least Momoe isn't a TERF. This finally takes us to Ai, who is, at this point of the story, just a distraction. I seriously believe she finished her character arc in the first 2 episodes because I cannot tell what she's supposed to learn from the events after that. I thought the Koito Sawaki conflict was supposed to be about losing someone you had a complicated relationship with, and dealing with the fact that life goes on without closure. But once they added Ai herself in the love pyramid out of nowhere, I threw in the towel. Nojima already wrote a show about a high school girl and her teacher, and I didn't want to see that again. As I mentioned before, this conflict feels so disconnected from the girls support girls theme the fights are supposed to symbolize. It's so frustrating that this is a major driving force in the plot. And I'm saying this after watching episode 12. I don't think that episode did anything except show that Ai loves her mom and is gonna let her date Sawaki. What I think the show should have done was allocate the time used for that conflict to establish her relationships with the other girls better, because she doesn't really have much else outside of being that one friend who is always there for you. Ai listens to her friends rant, comforts them through tough decisions, and looks sad when they talk about sad things. But I wish her empathy had flaws, just like the show says it does. We see episode 12 solved by Ai thinking about what's best for her mom and not herself. This is a main character with a story so messy, I can't even tell what she's supposed to overcome. So why should I care about her? So apart from Rika, I don't think this show's characters offer well-told or inspirational stories. I believe the script ran itself to the ground in episode 5 when Rika asks everyone if they really need to say wonder eggs in the first place, and establishes that these girls are not saving eggs and trying to revive their friends out of guilt anymore. So then what are they fighting for? They're doing it as teenage rebellion to build their identity. This is a pretty arbitrary and selfish reason, but that motive isn't a problem by itself. What makes it a problem is that these girls are playing superhero for themselves, and that conflicts with the girls support girls theme. The girls who hatch out of the wonder eggs are ultimately just pawns in a game total strangers are playing. It doesn't help that these girls are already dead either. Salvation after death, even if the girls can be revived, doesn't address the underlying reasons they committed suicide in the first place. The main cast, how they interact with each other, the motives, and the position of the egg girls all compound into a nihilistic worldview, one that doesn't value friendship nor the lives of the deceased girls. So I'm going to briefly compare WEP to Persona 5, but let me make it clear that I do have similar criticisms for that series too. I think the two main flaws of Persona 5's story is that the fandom thieves are the only ones who have the power to change society with their unrealistic magical powers, and the narrative doesn't let them make any mistakes. Unlike WEP though, I can actually tell that these kids really believe that they're fighting for justice. P5 is very good at showing systemic abuse, an actual network of adults that abuse their power. It is easy to see that the protagonists want to fight back against the evil adults because they too have been abused by them, and they can relate to the people they're trying to save. It is also worth mentioning that there are good adults in P5 who are crucial supporters of the protagonists. Unlike WEP, where I seems to be the only one who has supportive adults in her life. P5 shows that its protagonists have the attitude and support to win against their opponents. WEP, however, is focused on showing the girls grapple with their interpersonal conflicts and emotions. This would have been fine if the show gave us satisfying solutions, but WEP doesn't tell me why the girls can beat their enemies beyond the power of believing oneself, so it fails to convince me that the story actually cares about the resolution of their conflicts, which in this case is the lives of young girls. What I find most upsetting about WEP thematically though is how the show treats suicide as something that just happens to people. Frill's backstory destroyed what little goodwill I had in this show, because not only did it change the show from a metaphorical social commentary to defeat the big bad evil, it took away the agency of the characters. Let's look back at Kotobuki describing her death. There was a sweet smell of honey. I feel like an insect preyed upon a carnivorous plant. My mind and body were abducted by an innocent sorrow. The way she poetically describes death portrays it as something she couldn't resist. The cause of the Ek girls' deaths isn't the society that failed to help them, but a magical temptation of death that entices girls who didn't have to die. This means that WEP no longer blames the suicide of episode 4's victim of sexual harassment on her harasser or her unsupportive parents, but on Frill for somehow pushing her over the edge. By blaming a magical robot, the message of the show becomes muddled because the Wonder Killer fights did not reflect any underlying evil. And by blaming the central conflict, the death of girls, on a supernatural power, the show is prevented from addressing the concrete systematic issues its girls face, so it can no longer give us a satisfying conclusion. And what makes this even worse is how the story of Frill depicts this temptation of death as inherent in female adolescence. Frill isn't just an evil AI, she was designed to have all the qualities of a teen girl. She became a jealous and selfish murderer because her teenage girlhood was upset, and all other troubled teen girls are susceptible to her influences because they also have this flawed quality. The temptation of death reveals that, at best, the Egg girls were victims of some natural feminine flaw they couldn't fight back to begin with, or at worst, they were too weak to resist the teenage hormones making them miserable. I know some people have argued that the Aka brothers shouldn't be trusted and what they say shouldn't be taken at face value, but the show hasn't really done anything to challenge the gender essentialism they spew.
男は目的の、女は感情の。
女は衝動的で他人の声に影響されやすいからね。
女だからその時その時で感情は爆発するだろ。
純粋で汚れない。大人の愛よりずっと脆くて儚くて美しいから。
Himari, the Aka brothers' daughter, was perfectly fine until she became a teenager. And bringing back Nojima's past works, the way they fetishize the idea of teenage girls, how they believe being uncontrollable is the essence of femininity, is totally in line with how Nojima writes most of his female characters. The reason why WEP's teenage girls are miserable is simply because they are teenage girls. What encouragement are we supposed to get from this story? WEP tells me that if I die, my friends are gonna find new friends and more or less forget about me. It tells me that suicide just kinda happens. It tells me that it's up to teenage girls to carry the weight that is placed on them by terrible adults, but it's going to be difficult for them because teenage girls are somehow inherently flawed and far too emotional. It tells me that it feels sorry for the girls getting abused, but offers no real solution for combating that abuse. But maybe one of those girls will get lucky, and her handsome art teacher will tell her that that's what makes her beautiful, and show her his artwork. Anime doesn't need Wonder Egg priority. Anime doesn't need to tell Nojima Shinji's melodramatic tragedy point when there are so many other shows that do what it wants to do better. By contrast, Madoka Magica tells a tragedy about teen girls placed in awful situations while also giving them control over their destiny. Those girls actually have choices to make, and it's those choices that drive the story. P5 is a story about teens fighting back against abusers that understands the necessity of dependable adults and immediate support systems, and shows that it is worth trying to make the world a better place. And if someone argues that Web is somehow more inspirational just because it's dark, they obviously haven't seen the many ways Pretty Cure explores and celebrates femininity. That is a series founded on the idea of expanding how femininity is shown in anime. Hell, anime already has Mari Okada, a director famous for teen melodramas. Many of her works also touch on serious themes and are overall more empowering stories. The most I can credit Web for is some attractive character animation, and even that is not worth the major crunching the studio had to do. This show is a wreck even on the production level. According to planning producer Ueno Hiroyuki, Web's project started from the idea of bringing professionals from other fields into anime, and I don't think this was a bad plan. It's exciting to see known names in one medium work on a new project in another, and I could see that there was a lot of love poured into the show. But the moment they decided to have Nojima Shinji in charge of the script, this show's story was destined to be the disaster it became. From my view, no amount of skilled animation, voice acting, or directing was able to hide how Nojima was still writing 90s melodramas. But hey, it looks like Web is popular despite this. Whether I like it or not, Nojima does have a lucrative track record. Hell, maybe Wonder Egg Priority will get a video game just like Without Family. You know, the show about the homeless girl I mentioned at the start? Yeah, it got a choose your own adventure game for the Playdia. Oh, you don't know about the Bandai home console Playdia? It was sold in 1994 and had exactly 33 games. Anyway, the gist of the game is that you watch clips from the show and it occasionally stops you to make decisions, but obviously it's based on a TV show that finished airing, so there's a very defined storyline you have to follow. The game pretends to give you choices, but the only controls you have in the narrative is being able to skip scenes for the show depending on what you choose.